The Beatles, the biggest band in music history and one of the most influential cultural figures in pop culture. Whilst known for their music, obviously, I want to focus on another one of their influential ventures, that being their films. Now, there are 5 films which the Beatles took part in as a band. Of course, there are other, however, I strictly want to look at their films they made as a band. The first of those being 1964's A Hard Day's Night. It's been a Now, the film is a black and white, almost mockumentary style film, following a 36-hour time period wherein the Beatles travelled in from Liverpool to London to perform a televised performance. The film follows each character and their misadventures along the way. Whether it be Ringo, who is essentially told to live life, not read books by Paul's granddad, leading him to causing trouble in a pub, or in a very amusing scene in which George Harrison is mistaken for an actor at an advertising agency, wherein the boss doesn't even know who he is, even stating he wants to appeal to a younger audience, which we see in the film the Beatles are, mostly younger people into them. His assistant even whispering in his ear, George Harrison.
Yes, he's a definite boss. He'll look good alongside Susan. All right, Sammy Jim, this is all going to be quite painless. Don't breathe on me, Adrian.
John Lennon is particularly strong in the film, whether it be the woman who recognises him but can't remember his name, features some funny lines and great acting from Lennon.
I knew I could rely on you.
Thanks.
You don't look like him at all.
Or a scene in which he's playing in the bathtub in which you can see the other actors trying not to break character.
Said I could. Honestly, my mind boggles at the very idea. A grown man and you haven't shaved with a safety razor.
It's not my fault. I come from a long line of electricians.
Well, you're not practicing.
Paul's scenes often involve him mostly with his granddad, who causes trouble everywhere he goes. The granddad, played by actor Wilfred Bramble, is often throughout the film referred to as being very clean, which is actually a reference to his character in the show Steptoe and Son, wherein he plays a character which can be described as a dirty old man, also playing on the fact he is shown to be a troublemaker, thus Paul's lines about.
He's a villain, a real mixer, and he cost you a fortune in breach of promise cases.
The line I just showed you is actually a law in England and Wales in which a person could sue for damages after a broken engagement, thus him being a literal dirty old man, which we see throughout the film, wherein he causes trouble for the group, like stealing Ringo's invite to a gambling club and selling forged Beatles autographs to fans, which eventually caused him to be apprehended by the police.
I know your game. You get me into the toilet room, and then out come the rubber hoses.
The film, I think, captures the chaotic life which the Beatles lived, from the opening scene in which they say they are getting chased by fans, which is a common theme throughout the film, as we see Ringo chased later on in the film. And shows the mundanity of these things, such as practice and interviews, which they clearly find boring. The film, I do think, humanises each of them as well, as despite their massive popularity, the film, in my opinion, grounds them and makes them almost seem like high school children, with their constant antics and joking around.
Yeah. How did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Which is made quite obvious with their often flirtatious interactions with women, whether it be George looking at the secretary's legs, or the band flirting with the dancers, or the teasing of the schoolgirls who clearly knew who they were, thus the Beatles playing on their affection for them.
You've got to killing me. I was named them innocent. I don't want to go.
Sorry for disturbing you, girls.
Now, you can't talk about the film without talking about their music, which is of course fantastic. The way it's implemented is very well done and seamless in my opinion, whether it be the opening scene of them escaping their fans, to practicing on stage, or a scene which is considered a very important milestone in music history, wherein they essentially create a music video with cuts and high-octane camera work, which foreshadows what would later come down the line, so much so the director of the film, Richard Lester, on a DVD interview of the film, said that people would see him as the dad of MTV. This music video idea would continue through all of their films. They are credited with pushing the boundary of music videos. The film's only nitpick I have is perhaps the acting isn't perfect. However, that works in the film's favour, kind of, as the Beatles admitted they weren't actors, so much so they often improvised lines. Those improvised lines being some of the funniest scenes, which I think made the film better. And their acting being a bit strange works in the film's favour, as it does give off the feeling of it being real, even sometimes you don't believe what the characters are saying.
If it's your grandfather, who knows?
However, even still, their overall performances are great, and you can't expect non-actors to be Daniel Day-Lewis. However, they were still believable. The director even stated that he believed that George Harrison was the best actor. a great actor in fact, whilst the producer of the film, Walter Sensen, believed that Ringo was the best, thus the reason that both George and Ringo were probably the most successful in the film industry, as George would go on to fund the Monty Python films, and Ringo would be the most accomplished actor. And I think that will be noticeable throughout these films, is that Ringo is often the main character, perhaps due to his natural screen presence and his ability to be himself, which often resulted in funny moments throughout these films.
But you have other things to offer. I mean, looking
Oh, yes, Michael, you're telling them now.
What about acting? Now,
Acting?
You've done a lot of
Couldn't get a
acting.
job if I died.
You've always been a film fan, haven't you?
I love films. I love cameras, as you may have noticed.
Overall, A Hard Day's Night is incredible and is a very influential film, with it being credited with being the main influence on The Monkees, a highly popular 1960s TV show about the American pop band Monkees, and influencing music videos down the line, with MTV and even commercials, all because of this film. Overall, a fantastic film to kick off the Beatles' film adventures, and a funny one at that. Their next film would come a year later, that being 1965's Help.
I need somebody help, not just anybody help. You know,
Now, the Beatles had a free film contract in which they had to appear in 3 films contractually, this film being the second one, and they themselves, unlike A Hard Day's Night, didn't really enjoy the filming experience of this due to their schedule becoming much more hectic as Beatlemania continued to grow around the world, thus more demand for their music, thus more writing and record sessions and touring. And the film takes places across several different countries, which of course would be tiring for each of them. The film follows the band focusing on an Eastern cult who, in order to sacrifice someone, they must be wearing a ruby red ring, which Ringo has, thus they track him down and try to get the ring off him, thus the band travels around the world to avoid them. The film this time is shot in colour and isn't as grounded as the last one, featuring very slapstick moments and sci-fi elements, like Paul shrinking to a small size, or the constant fourth wall breaks throughout the film. The film also features a scene in which George Harrison's shirt rips due to a hairdryer, which at the time apparently made fangirls scream during the movie. The scene, despite this, is still funny due to it only ripping his shirt off and nothing else.
Hey, my skin's soaked right through to the skin.
There's more here than meets the eye.
Ho, ho.
And during the scene in which they go to the Bahamas, they almost kind of predict how each member would look in the future. That's quite funny. Perhaps the band knew what they wanted to look like in the future.
we just put it round, we're going there. We're not going there. We just put it round, we're going there. Just so everybody would think we were going there.
I'd like to go there.
Now, a major critique of the film, specifically from the band, was that they felt as though they were side characters in their own film. Which I agree with somewhat, as it does feel like the cult has a lot of screen time. However, the film's funniest scenes usually feature the band, whether it be the random intermission.
Intermission. End of intermission.
Or when Ringo gets stuck down in a basement with a tiger and they all start to sing Beethoven in order to calm the tiger down. The film has a very art pop style, so much so John Lennon says that they helped influence the style of the 1965 Batman TV series.
Some days you just can't get rid of a bomb.
And much like A Hard Day's Night, the film clearly helped inspire music videos even further. Specifically, the Ticket to Ride segment of the film, which much like the first film, incorporates cutting the images to coincide with the music, but this time with a bigger budget. Of course, their music was, like always, fantastic, and obviously becoming much more in the direction of their later, more avant-garde art music. And the film is clear to see it's influenced comedy, whether it be Spike Lee, who said it was a massive influence on him, or even a comedic masterpiece like Airplane.
Take a guess? Well, not for another 2 hours.
You can't take a guess for another 2 hours?
No, I mean we can't land for another 2 hours.
Which this film influence can be seen in that film as well. While it's not their best film in my opinion, it's still funny, well directed and acted, with a little unfocused, but overall still a great Beatles film. Their next film was The Magical Mystery Tour. Now this is just a very fever dream-like film, inspired by Ken Kesey's Merry Pranks and Psychedelic Bus Trips, and the Beatles' own experience on coaches. However, unlike the first two films, there wasn't really a script, thus the film's frantic, chaotic energy.
It's coming. Where's the buff?
Now, it's at least for me hard to talk about the film, as it's essentially just a bunch of skits I don't really like. However, the film, I do think, has good ideas, or ideas that which made it in other films a bit better. E.g., a film like Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain is quite similar to this film in some ways. Both films use very surreal images, and of course, use an avant-garde approach. The Holy Mountain was even funded by John Lennon and Yoko Ono in 1973. Another film I would compare it to would be Monty Python's The Meaning of Life. One scene in particular in which Lennon continuously puts spaghetti on a woman's plate, essentially forcing her to eat in an almost disturbing horror-like scene.
In 45 minutes, I can hardly get my breath.
It's intake, Jessie, not output.
I am.
A similar scene in The Meaning of Life features a scene in which comedically obese man is persuaded to keep eating until he potentially vomits everywhere. Both scenes feature people who show little to no reaction, in my opinion, showing a kind of connection between the band's type of humour and the connection with other British groups such as Monty Python.
Yeah, in the late 60s, when Monty Python first came on television in the UK, well, there was, you know, what the Beatles were representing, or were trying to, you know, we were trying to be something new. We're trying to, you know, give some alternatives, and likewise in the comedy situation, everything was pretty boring, I thought. It was pretty much the same for years and years, and then Python came along with this totally off-the-wall type of humor, and, you know, they were sort of laughing about most of the things which should be laughed about, I think. You know, the governments and just the way we all are. I mean, the usual things. And they didn't really leave much unturned.
The film was just rather strange, so much so the reception at the time was very negative, which was influenced by the BBC, who aired the film in black and white, which angered members of the band, particularly Lennon. So much so McCartney was essentially forced to almost apologise for it.
Now, the critical failure of Broad Street.
Both of them, Magical Mystery Tour too. So nobody likes to be told they don't get it right. In fact, what's happened with Magical Mystery Tour, I think, is that now it's got a lot of people who like it, whereas what happened was it actually came out on, I think it was Boxing Day or Christmas Day, and it was what I call the Bruce Forsyth slot. You know, it should have been, hello viewers, how are you, happy Christmas, had your Christmas pud? It was that slot, and it was all, walrus. You know, it was just not what the majority of those 20 million viewers expected. So it got slammed, I think, from that kind of angle.
As before this, almost everything the Beatles did, especially their movies, did well and were received well critically. And I think demonstrates the Beatles' transformation musically to a much more avant-garde, barrier-pushing sound, which influenced, of course, their music, but also their films. Overall, a very unique film, certainly. Not their best, and very hard to watch, in my opinion, but is somewhat influential, specifically towards the groups such as Monty Python, who, in my opinion, perfected the formula the Beatles tried to create for this film. The Beatles' next film was their last of their 3-film deal, that being the highly influential animated film, Yellow Submarine. We all live in a yellow submarine. The film, unlike the other Beatles films, doesn't actually feature the Beatles. Well, it does come the ending, however, their animated characters are voiced by actors, due to the Beatles not being satisfied with how their 1965 film Help went, as they felt as though they weren't the main characters of their own. Now, Yellow Submarine isn't really plot heavy, per se. It's more of a different film to showcase the Beatles' more popular songs, at the time, from several different albums rather than just one, and features a lot of musical scenes throughout, some of which are connected to the plot, some of which aren't. The film's plot follows the Beatles, who are asked by Captain Fred to come with him to Pepperland in order to save it from the Blue Meanies, who hate music and have overtaken. Unlike most of the other Beatles films, there is an actual antagonist of the film, that being Chief Blue Meanie, who for kids' film, in inverted commas, is rather scary, oftentimes screaming and abusive towards his men.
My little
so glad he does.
His face often getting close to the camera, the scary nature to him, particularly his voice, which is often high-pitched, was one of the main inspirations for Mark Hamill's voice as the Joker. Now, the film is very funny in my opinion, which comes from the dry deadpan humour. For example, the film, due to its animation form, is very surreal, and thus not realistic. Thus, when Captain Fred visits the Beatles' house, Ringo drives him around where we see various objects come to life. From a pair of eyes and glasses to giant slugs, or John Lennon literally becoming Frankenstein.
I've just had the strangest dream.
All of which fits the film, and is elevated by the Beatles' lack of reaction to it. The film features some very interesting and fantastic animation sequences, whether it be the trippy musical sequences that can go from the Beatles transforming into old men.
Ringo. Oh dear. Oh, we're all the same.
Saying delinquents.
And I can hear my beard grow.
Or several other incredibly animated, trippy scenes, with various surreal images surrounding them. Only a Northern Song scene, which to me is one of the film's most impressive scenes, for its hypnotic, fast-paced imagery. Or the Nowhere Man scene, which I think incorporates one of their songs brilliantly into the film's plot, with the introduction to Jeremy Hillary Boob, PhD.
Oh, so little time. Ha ha, so much to know.
Look, can you tell us where we're at?
A true Socratic query, that.
Oh, yeah. I know the Billy Shears are you.
A strange, furry creature who is highly intelligent and often speaks in rhymes. However, the Beatles point out the fact that he doesn't use his brain/abilities for anything, thus him being a literal nowhere man. The character itself being a parody of public intellectuals, thus his way of speaking. And, much like the other films, Ringo is sort of the main character, thus him being the first Beatle introduced and to notice the Yellow Submarine, and him taking the Nowhere Man into this submarine, due to him seeming to like him.
Hey, Mr. Boo, you can come with us if you like.
You mean you'd take a nowhere man?
Yeah, come on, we'll take you somewhere.
Which is incorporated into the ending, as the Nowhere Man is one of the reasons they're able to defeat the Blue Meanies. The film's ending features the Beatles defeating the Blue Meanies via their music, accompanied by the song All You Need Is Love, thus love defeating evil, which the Blue Meanies represent, alongside Jeremy, who finally uses his intellect for good and defeats the chief Blue Meanie. And it ends with himself in a live-action scene originally would have had much more trippy psychedelic background, however they didn't, thus the black background behind them.
Look at John, will ya?
What's the matter, John, love? Blue meanies?
Newer and bluer meanies have been sighted within the vicinity of this theatre. There's only one way to go out.
How's that? Singing!
The film's humour features a lot of Beatles in-jokes and puns. For example, one time Captain Fred references the song Help.
Help! Won't you please help me?
Be Pacific.
Which works very well with the tripan humour of the film, and often is contrasted by the magical hypnotic surroundings/environments that the Beatles find themselves in. And they brought in Liverpool poet Roger McGowan in order to give the film a much more Liverpudlian feel to the dialogue. The film's impact cannot be understated. It is credited with making animation, which was constantly associated with children, into a much more adult-orientated thing, as well as it being considered to be an actual art form, which both children and adults could watch and enjoy on multiple levels. The film, in some ways, is one of the most important pieces of animation ever, as there are various pieces of media that exist because of it, some of which are considered some of the best ever in that medium, and became a thing because of this film. Films such as Toy Story or Shrek wouldn't even exist, especially a comedic style, and iconic seminal TV shows such as South Park and The Simpsons wouldn't exist either. The Simpsons in particular had several scenes in their episodes referencing the film due to its high influence on the show.
Look, fellas, it's Lisa in the sky.
No diamonds, though.
Look out for the campy drawing of Queen Victoria.
Oh, God, help us. Help us.
And much like the Beatles' first film, A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles loved it. Lennon said it was the best Beatles film. Paul liked it as well, however regretted themselves not lending their voices to the film, and George loved the fact that the band wasn't too heavily involved in the film. George seemed the Beatles to least like filming of their past movies. Overall, one of the best Beatles films, and one of the most important animated films of all time. And now to the final Beatles film from 1970, Let It Be.
Let it be, let it be.
Now, it's quite fitting that the first Beatles film is a sort of mockumentary style film, and the last film is actually a documentary. Now, the film was originally supposed to be a TV documentary which would end with a concert broadcast. However, that idea was abandoned, and instead the film follows the recording of the Beatles' final album, Let It Be, ending their last performance together as a group in the infamous roof concert. Now, the film is weird in the sense it features no commentary from the director and is essentially almost pure music.
But I'm gonna go.
Showing them talking about how they want certain songs to sound, and interspersed with scenes of them performing those songs from the album. The film is kind of hailed to be a look into the Beatles and their increasingly fractured relationship. However, we barely see that throughout the film. As most of the film, the band looks mostly happy working together, whether it be Ringo messing around with Paul's adopted daughter, or them covering several rock songs, in which you see the band having fun. The film originally was much longer and focused a lot on Yoko and Lennon, which the band weren't fond of, as they wanted the film to be a much nicer film, rather than showing a bit more of the downside and tension which was there within the band. For example, them cutting out any mention of George leaving the band. Now, Lennon himself was particularly not fond of the film, as he felt as though it made Paul look as though he was the only one trying. The other Beatles were just lazy. Quote, "The people that cut it as Paul was God, and we're just lying around," end quote. And despite the film not showing much tension between the group, we do see glimpses, such as John Lennon's dance with Yoko due to him not wanting to play on the song I, Me, Mine, due to it being a waltz and not a rock and roll song, thus him waltzing, dancing with Yoko. Or, in one of the film's most infamous scenes, an argument in which Paul thinks he's annoying George, despite George not seeming that offended, but Paul still insisting that he's offended George in some way.
Okay, look, I'm not trying to say that. I'm not trying to say that. You're doing it as though I'm trying to say that. And what we said the other day, I'm not trying to get you. Well, I really am trying to just say, look, lads.
And a scene in which Paul talks to John about the band's inclination to stay and record in the album studio. However, I think the scene points at the beef between both of them, as it's shot with the camera facing the back of Paul, his face not visible, and John behind it, John is visible, wherein you see a very bored John listening to Paul drone on.
We played the ballroom and we had the worst first night thing and we were all nervous and it was terrible. Then we played another the next night, it got a little bit better. The next night, and then the next night, it was just fucking too much of it. Playing because we got over the hang of the audience.
The film's reputation, I believe, might come down to two factors. First of all, the timing of it. It released after the official split of the band, and when the film won an Oscar for the Best Original Song Score, none of the Beatles attended, instead being accepted by Quincy Jones on their behalf. However, Paul accepted the Grammy for it and thus people blamed the film for showing the band in the bad light, despite the film only barely touching on it. And I think how the film looked, as they changed the aspect ratio of the film, which gave it this very grainy look, resulted in it having a much more darker look compared to what the remastered version of it, wherein we can see it was actually a very colourful film, compared to what it was originally shown in. And at the time, the only truly light part of the film was the ending, which was of course their last live performance together. It's a sort of swan song of sorts, ending on the line from John.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition.
There you have it. The entirety of the Beatles films, each of which, whilst not all perfect, do have their own interesting style or thing to say, whether it be the hilarity of A Hard Day's Night, the psychedelia of Yellow Submarine, or the last live performance in Let It Be. Each film is unique in its own way, and overall I think really adds to the legend of the Beatles, whether good or bad. I think these films, in some aspects, are timeless, highly influential pieces of media that influenced other different important TV shows and films. One aspect that I think they capture is humour, which even despite these films not being the most new and quite old in fact, they still managed to be funny, and in particular their first two films, humour is still hilarious, as it's still quite reminiscent of modern day humour, like the scene on A Hard Day's Night in which they are interviewed by the media, which a lot of the Beatles' responses to me almost sound like a modern day type of humour, and jokes you would see someone comment on Instagram or Twitter.
Oh, do you often see your father?
No, actually, we're just good friends.
How do you like your girlfriends to dress?
But when I was making this video, halfway through the news of the Beatles biopics and the actors came out to some controversy, with people either liking it for the actors' acting ability or hating it due to the actors looking nothing like each. Whilst both, in my opinion, are very valid criticisms, the most important thing to me that they must capture in each of these biopics is the Beatles' humour. The humour is a vital aspect that I think they must capture in order to make the films great and be true to each of the Beatles. Overall, these are very interesting pieces of media, some of which are, in my opinion, essential viewing for comedy and animation. Others are just interesting and show different creative sides to the Beatles. Overall, I recommend them, especially if you're a Beatles fan. Thanks for watching, and watch out for
Blue Meanies!
Blue Meanies!
Blue Meanies?
Blue Meanie!